Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into a really remarkable, though often overlooked chapter of history. We're looking at early 20th century geopolitics and economic rivalry. Specifically, the German leasehold territory of Qingdao. It's nestled there in the Chinese province of Shandong, active, 1898 to 1914.
That's the time frame, yeah. But this isn't just a story about, gunboats and flags.
No, exactly. It's really a story about competing economic ideas, clashing in one specific, very volatile place.
Absolutely right. And our mission here for this deep dive is to try and isolate and really understand a core historical debate, an economic debate, that played out right there on the ground.
Which model won out? Was it the pure laissez-faire free trade idea, or was it the heavily regulated state interventionist approach?
And maybe more importantly, who actually benefited? Who are the winners when it all shook out?
We've got some incredible source material for this, it looks like, drawn from a really detailed historical study focusing on the economic policies of two different groups.
Right. You've got the German colonial government, the Qing government on one side.
And then the powerful neighboring Chinese provincial government of Shandong on the other.
And we're essentially tracking how these two, very different administrative setups tried to plug themselves into the world market.
And all the tensions, the cooperation, sometimes surprising cooperation, and the results that came out of that interaction.
And to help guide us through all this complexity, we're kind of using the story of one specific German company, Diederichsen, Ebsen and Company. Let's call them D&J.
Right, D&J. Founded right in 1898, the same year Germany got the lease.
Exactly. They were classic private operators, Hamburg merchants. And they got caught right in the middle, squeezed between the, let's say, rigid German naval bureaucracy, the protectionist policies back home in Germany, and also the rapidly changing strategies of the Chinese regional government, which was trying to strengthen itself.
So their story, their decade in Qingdao, it's like a perfect window into this whole economic contest.
It really is, because you can see the contrast so clearly. You've got that free trade model championed by the British, right? You see it in Hong Kong. And closer by, in the Chinese treaty port of Yantai.
That's Model A, the laissez-faire approach.
Then you have Model B, the highly regulated interventionist path preferred by the German Naval Administration in Qingdao.
And the real curveball here, also the calculated protectionist path chosen by the Chinese provincial officials themselves.
Yeah, and we'll see how this mix didn't just lead to head-on conflict. It actually created this deep fragmentation within the local market that reshaped the entire economic landscape of Shandong.
Okay, so to really get why a German government, which was, fundamentally protectionist at home, would set up a colony aiming for something different abroad, we're going to need to rewind. Go back to Germany itself, back to these huge economic shifts in the 1870s, because that's what really pushed German private money, German traders, to look overseas in the first place.
Yeah, this is where the paradox really lies. German unification, it wasn't just political, it forced a complete economic rethinking. And central to that was adopting the gold standard in 1873.
Right, the gold standard. Standardizing the currency across all the different German states, trying to create stability for international trade, show fiscal responsibility.
Exactly, projecting power on the global stage.
And they could actually do it, in large part, because of that massive amount of money they got from France after the Franco-Prussian War, that war indemnity.
That influx of gold was crucial, yeah. It gave them the reserves to back the new gold mark. But like you said, stability came with a pretty hefty domestic price tag.
It really did. Gold standards, especially when they're new, tend to be deflationary. They restrict the government's ability to, fiddle with monetary policy to boost the economy at home.
And then, making things even tougher for some, you had Chancellor Bismarck bringing in protective tariffs. First in 1879, then tightening them again in 1885.
Which was largely a political move, wasn't it? Favoring the big Prussian landowners and heavy industry.
Over the maritime traders and consumers, yeah, it was a compromise.
So this combination, a rigid gold standard plus high domestic tariffs, it kicks off what people at the time called the Gründerkrise. The Long Depression, basically, lasting from 74 well into the early 1890s.
Precisely. And this whole environment created, the sources call it a deep-seated mistrust among traders towards their own new national government and towards the gold market itself.
It was like a philosophical rejection almost, and a financial one too.
For sure. Think about the Hanseatic League cities, Hamburg especially. Their whole history, their identity was built on free trade, on maritime freedom. They often felt closer to British commercial ways than Prussian agricultural policy.
So these new protectionist rules felt like a direct attack on their livelihood.
Absolutely. And this pessimism wasn't just talk. It changed how people acted in the market. There's this interesting little moment in 1878. A rumor goes around that Brazil failed to secure a loan from London. Now, normally, in a gold standard world, you'd expect the price of British sterling, the gold-backed currency, to maybe dip a bit on those kinds of jitters, reflecting uncertainty.
Right. Less demand for gold, maybe?
But this time, demand for gold didn't decrease. It stayed strong. It shows how confusing and, frankly, unpredictable this new currency system felt to traders who were used to something else.
Risk calculations were just all over the place.
Yeah. And for the merchants who specialized in international finance, the gold standard basically wiped out one of their key profit sources, currency arbitrage.
Okay, let's dig into that arbitrage idea, because that explains why China, a silver-based economy, became so attractive. You mentioned Theodore Will, a big Hamburg trader.
Right. Before German currency got unified under the gold mark in '73, Will was making serious money playing the differences between silver, like the Brazilian mil réis, and gold currencies, like British sterling.
So arbitrage is basically just profiting from tiny temporary price differences for the same thing, in this case, money in different places.
Exactly. The messy mix of currencies in Germany before 1873, plus the constant ups and downs of global silver and gold prices, created lots of opportunities for sharp traders like Will.
And the gold standard just flattened all that out domestically.
It did. And it narrowed the opportunities globally, too, as other countries also moved towards stabilizing their currencies. That whole profit stream just evaporated for German traders operating within the gold bloc.
So it's ironic, isn't it? The gold standard was meant to integrate Germany, Project Power, but the pain it caused at home and getting rid of those arbitrage loopholes actually sped up industrialization and pushed private capital out.
Precisely. German merchants, shippers, they were fed up with the regulated gold mark system at home, so they actively looked for alternatives overseas. And silver-using countries like China looked really good. The old arbitrage game was still potentially playable there.
And this economic pressure, it forced a really important reaction from the private sector itself, didn't it? These strong vertical networks started forming.
Yes, exactly. Companies like H. Diederichsen in Kiel, the shipbuilders Howeltzwerk, and the M. Jepsen Shipping Company in Abenra, the guys who later formed D&J, they responded to all this instability by, well, banding together, cartelizing, diversifying.
These weren't just little trading outfits. They were powerful family networks.
Yeah.
The Jepsens, Jessens, Diederichsens, Howelts, they controlled everything.
Pretty much. They owned the ships, they built the ships, they handled the coal transport, they financed the whole operation. Vertical integration. It was specifically designed to protect themselves from the risks created by their own government's protectionist policies.
And the perfect example of this flight overseas is Michael Jepsen, the founder of that Jepsen shipping line.
Oh, yeah. He was railing against the domestic situation. He called it the protective duties delirium, just completely fed up.
So much so that by 1891, he sends his entire fleet, 8 steamers, all the way to Asia.
Every single one. And here's the kicker. He paid his crews in silver.
So he could immediately play the exchange rate game again.
Yeah, exactly. Widen his profit margins through that favorable arbitrage against the gold mark or the pound sterling. That right there is the key early link. German private shipping capital finding its way back to profit through the silver-based Chinese economy.
So the money that flowed into Qingdao when it was established in '98, it wasn't just idealistic, state-driven imperial cash that maybe the DV envisioned.
Not at all. A huge chunk of it was private merchant capital that was fundamentally anti-protectionist in spirit. It was capital fleeing a regulated Germany, looking for the kind of flexibility and profit margins that only silver economies seem to offer anymore.
Which set the stage for immediate conflict within the German camp itself, right from day one.
Absolutely. And once these German traders got to Shandong, they weren't just setting up shop in an empty space. They were right next door to the established British sphere of influence.
Right, which created this built-in contrast, this existing alternative model of how to do things economically.
Exactly. You had Model A already running, the British laissez-faire environment. You saw it big time in Hong Kong, obviously. But locally, right there in Shandong, you had the Chinese treaty port of Yantai, open since 1861.
And the British model was defined by what? Very little government interference?
Extremely low government economic presence, yeah. relying on the rule of law for contracts, free movement of capital, free trade. That was the idea.
And those German traders from the Hanseatic cities, the ones who hated Bismarck's tariffs back home, they must have felt pretty comfortable in that kind of British system.
They did. Firms like Karlowitz, Melchers, big German names, they thrived in places like Hong Kong, handling, get this, over half of Manchester's crucial cotton exports to China before 1914.
Wow. So the system, even though it was British-run, it worked well for foreign traders generally. Nationality wasn't the main barrier there.
Not really. It was about the system. And Yantai specifically showed how this free market approach could work locally. It quickly became a huge export hub, especially for things like straw braids.
Straw braids, like for hats and things.
Yeah, exactly. A big rural commodity. An industry initially set up and managed by British merchants, actually, and some French missionaries, who organized the production out in the countryside specifically for export. The system worked by enabling high-volume, low-margin deals.
Okay, but our sources point out a pretty significant dark side to this laissez-faire model in Shandong, this idea of an economic dual economy.
Very stark one.
You had this, like, super prosperous coast, Yantai, totally plugged into foreign trade, and then this desperately poor, financially disconnected rural interior right behind it. How did the finances of that actually work? What created that split?
Well, in the treaty port system, the value added to goods often had to cover really expensive financial operations. Things like foreign exchange, long-distance credit. Capital flowed easily on the coast thanks to foreign banks.
Right.
But out in the countryside, where the straw braids were actually being made or the peanuts grown, the producers had zero access to that cheap credit. They were stuck relying on local pawn shops, traditional money lenders.
Charging crazy interest rates, I bet.
Astronomical. We're talking maybe 24% a month. It just crushed the producers, kept them impoverished, while the middlemen on the coast handling the finance and export got rich. Laissez-faire, without any government attempt to bridge that gap, just made the inequality worse.
Okay, so that stark reality brings us to Model B, the German vision for Qingdao. Controlled, naval-run. Admiral Tirpitz, the guy who basically designed the colony, he was determined not to let that happen.
He was very explicit about it. He mandated a heavily regulated economy from the start. He hoped to avoid the wild speculation, the corruption, the boom and bust cycles he saw in other treaty ports.
And he was suspicious of big companies, wasn't he?
Deeply. He knew his history. He looked back at the failures of earlier colonial ventures that relied on huge, powerful chartered companies, like the old Dutch East India Company or Prussian examples. He specifically forbade setting up anything like that in Qingdao.
So no single monopoly company running the show.
No. He wanted to restrict monopolies, encourage, he hoped, a solid base of small and medium-sized German businesses. The goal was controlled, steady economic growth, dictated entirely by the naval government, the Qingdao government.
A nice idea on paper, but it immediately slammed into the reality of powerful private capital, didn't it? Enter Giebrechtsen and Jepsen, D&J.
Exactly. D&J represented precisely the kind of large-scale, vertically integrated shipping and trading operation Tirpitz was wary of. And yet, they were essential to getting the colony running. They snapped up crucial early contracts, transporting troops, running the vital postal steamer service between Shanghai and Qingdao.
So the first German governor, Admiral Rosendahl, he saw D&J arrive, and what did he think?
He basically saw them as a potential chartered colonial agent in disguise, a budding monopoly that could challenge the Navy's absolute authority. Rosendahl became almost obsessed with keeping D&J on a tight leash.
Leading to immediate conflict.
Intense conflict. He deliberately put their operations under a microscope, made everything difficult. It turned into what Jacob Jepsen himself later called an overly politicized business environment.
And it wasn't just red tape, was it? It got personal, punitive.
Oh, yeah. The land deal is the classic example. D&J needed land for offices, housing. Rosendahl's administration didn't just deny them the plot they wanted. When they finally got approval for a piece of land, the government intentionally carved it up and charged them 20 times the original price for just a fraction of it.
Wow. That's sending a message.
A very clear message. The Navy's in charge here, not you merchants. Rosendahl was constantly trying to find ways to cancel D&J's postal contract too, even though it was essential.
Yeah.
It shows the naval government prioritized bureaucratic control over pretty much everything else, economic efficiency, even the needs of its own German businesses.
This is exactly the kind of heavy-handed state intervention these Hanseatic traders had fled back in Germany.
And here it was again, maybe even worse, in their own colony. The German administration just couldn't seem to actually implement its own good policy goals effectively.
Even their attempts to regulate the market itself backfired, like with land speculation.
Right. They tried to stop land speculation by adding a special tax on top of the purchase price. But the bureaucracy was so slow, the procedures so complex, that speculators just bought up land anyway and sat on it while the value went up. It totally failed to create the stable, affordable land market they wanted for smaller businesses.
And then came the real killer blow, the sign that the Navy's dream of total control just wasn't going to happen. It came from Berlin, didn't it?
It did. Despite the Navy digging in its heels about German sovereignty over Qingdao, Berlin made a huge strategic decision. They agreed to allow a Chinese customs house to be set up inside Qingdao.
Wait, a Chinese customs house operating inside a German colony? Why was that such a big deal, such a disaster for the naval administration's plans?
Because it fundamentally undermined their claim of absolute control over Qingdao's economy. It meant Qingdao had to recognize the rules of the existing Chinese treaty port system. And crucially, it opened the door for the Chinese government to potentially impose its own tariffs and regulations within the German territory.
A massive climb down.
Huge. A massive concession, a huge psychological defeat for the Navy's vision of exclusive control. It basically invited the Chinese state to have an official economic presence inside the colony. And Rosendahl paid the price. He was dismissed pretty quickly, late 1898. He'd failed to boost the economy, and he'd failed to keep the Navy in sole charge.
So Rosendahl's out. His replacement, Governor Truppel, comes in around 1901. And it seems like he learned the lesson the hard way.
He definitely seems to have. Truppel immediately ditched the confrontational approach towards the Chinese officials next door. Instead, he started pursuing a policy of, well, robust and very calculated cooperation with the Shandong provincial government.
Which was led at the time by Governor Zhu Fu.
That's right. And this shift led to something the sources call visit diplomacy. Zhu Fu made this big, highly publicized visit to Qingdao in 1902. It basically institutionalized this new friendly relationship, got rid of that old hostile vibe.
And Truppel saw the benefits of cooperating.
Oh, absolutely. He understood leverage. By cooperating, Qingdao started providing resources to the Chinese province, actual funds for modernizing their police force, even some military assistance. This directly helped Zhu Fu strengthen his own regional power base, his administrative and, frankly, coercive abilities within Shandong.
And Zhu Fu played his part too. He became the biggest single Chinese investor in Qingdao itself. Was that just personal enrichment or part of a bigger plan?
Probably a bit of both, but the strategic aspect was definitely key. Sure, his investments helped fill the provincial government's coffers, but they also lined up perfectly with this major national initiative happening in China at the time. The Xinjiang, or New Policy reforms.
Yes, the Xinjiang reforms, launched by the central government after the Boxer Rebellion, right? As a reaction to foreign interference.
Exactly. They were explicitly designed to beef up the regional Chinese state, protect native industries from foreign competition, what officials were openly calling shangzan, or commercial warfare.
So protectionist strategy, but implemented internally.
Very much so. The Shandong government, under Zhu Fu, got specific. They started taxing the coastal trading sectors, especially hitting the established treaty port, Yantai, and using that money to fund massive government investments inland. In finance, agriculture, local manufacturing.
So they were deliberately pulling economic energy away from the private, foreign-influenced coast.
And redirecting it towards the public, state-controlled interior. It was a conscious policy of internal economic rebalancing.
It sounds like they were basically hijacking the German infrastructure, the port, the new railway lines the Germans were building to fuel their own nationalist economic agenda.
That's the central irony of this whole alliance. And the key tool for Zhu Fu was the provincial bank, the Shandong Guangqinju.
Okay, the provincial bank. What was its job?
Its explicit goal was to suck capital out of the private money market, the market that had been dominated for decades by foreign banks and non-native Chinese traders from places like Shanghai and Guangdong.
And funnel that money where?
Into a new government-controlled money market that gave preferential treatment to native Shandong merchants.
How did they actually suck the resources out? Did they just order people to use the bank?
It was a mix of carrots and sticks. They got control mainly by monopolizing crucial functions like handling government tax revenues, and they offered much better deals, preferential rates, easier access to state contracts if you were a native Shandong merchant involved in a state-approved project.
Ah, I see.
So if you were a local guy working on, say, a new textile mill backed by the province, the Guangquanju was suddenly a much better, safer bet than any foreign bank or traditional lender. It created this powerful powerful parallel financial system that just bypassed the old treaty port banks and squeezed out the non-native traders who relied on that older system.
Okay, let's make this concrete. That straw braid trade we talked about, the big export commodity from Yantai, that became a major focus for this new Sino-German cooperation, right?
The perfect example. The shared goal for both the German administration under Triple and the Chinese administration under Xu Fu was to deliberately reroute this massive trade flow away from Yantai and through Qingdao instead.
Starve Yantai, feed Qingdao. How did they do it?
A classic carrot and stick.
What was the carrot for the German firms involved in the trade?
A huge customs discount. This was key. Qingdao offered a massive break. The export duty on straw braids was only 10 marks per 100 kilos. Compare that to 18 marks at other Chinese ports like Yantai.
That's a big difference.
Huge. It made it almost a no-brainer for the big German export firms, even ones like Karlovitz, who were ideologically more laissez-faire, to start shipping their straw braids out via Qingdao. And then Hapag, the big German shipping line, jumped in and offered much cheaper freight rates from Qingdao back to Hamburg. The economics just flipped entirely towards Qingdao.
Okay, that's the carrot. What was the stick? How did they control the supply?
That's where the Chinese provincial government came in, using its power in the interior. They set up state-run vocational workshops deep inland, sometimes using Manchu bannermen who needed work, sometimes even prison labor specifically for producing and weaving these straw braids.
Wow. State-directed manufacturing.
Classic example. Production and distribution were now being directly managed or heavily influenced by the growing public sector. This cut out the need for the old decentralized network of private buyers and agents that used to feed the Yantai market.
And this strategy also involved empowering a new group of Chinese business agents, ones loyal to the provincial state.
Absolutely. Officials like Yuan Shikai, who was very powerful in the region, deliberately promoted local chambers of commerce. But these weren't independent business groups like we might think of them. No, they acted more like quasi-government agencies. They were used to supervise production standards, enforce rules, and basically strengthen the political grip and personal authority of the provincial officials who sponsored them.
And this loops back to finance again. Native Chinese merchants, you mentioned Fu Bingzhao, worked directly with Xu Fu's provincial bank, the Guangkanju.
Right. They worked together specifically to try and monopolize the currency exchange market within Qingdao itself.
Taking it away from whom?
Their strategic aim was to completely replace the credit and exchange market that had been dominated for so long by the non-native traders, especially the powerful Cantonese and Shanghai merchants who had been the financial backbone of the treaty port system for decades.
So the German desire for a stable, predictable, regulated market.
It inadvertently created the perfect conditions, the perfect platform for an aggressive Chinese regional protectionism. A protectionism designed specifically to benefit native Shandong merchants and fill the provincial government's bank account.
So by around 1908, Qingdao wasn't really a model German free port anymore, was it? Nor just a naval base.
Not at all. It had morphed into this really sophisticated hybrid system, a channel, essentially, for the Chinese regional state to wage its own economic war, Shangzan, against both foreign competitors and against its domestic, non-native Chinese rivals.
Okay, so this rise of a state-controlled sector in Shandong, fueled by cooperation with the Germans in Qingdao, it didn't just create tension between Germans and Chinese, did it? It caused huge splits within the Chinese business community there.
Oh, absolutely. Deep fragmentation. You saw intense friction erupting right inside Qingdao between the native Shandong merchants, the ones now favored by Xu Fu and his provincial bank, and the established non-native merchants, mostly from Guangdong and Shanghai.
And this sometimes boiled over into public actions, boycotts, strikes.
Yeah, there were significant boycotts and strikes, especially around 1906 and 1908. Now, often these were presented, externally as protests against the Germans, and they did serve that purpose sometimes, giving Chinese officials more leverage in negotiations.
But there was an internal dynamic, too.
A really important one. These actions also served to strengthen the hand of the native Shandong merchants against their old rivals, the Cantonese and Shanghainese traders who had dominated the treaty ports for so long. It was a way of clearing out the competition using nationalist sentiment.
Which leads to the ultimate irony. What actually happened to most German businesses in Qingdao?
Yeah.
the ones who weren't plugged into these state contracts.
Well, while the total amount of trade going through Qingdao definitely went up, the port was busy, the economic structure that developed completely failed to achieve the original German goal of promoting broad German commercial interests.
The numbers really tell the story, don't they?
They're stark. German manufactured goods, the stuff Germany actually wanted to sell to China, consistently made up only a tiny slice of the trade volume, maybe 6 to 8%.
So what was Qingdao mostly shipping?
It primarily became a super efficient pipeline for exporting Chinese raw materials and agricultural products, coal, straw braids, peanuts out to the world market. It was facilitating the state-regulated economy of the Shandong interior, not acting as a gateway for German industrial products coming in.
Why couldn't German goods get a foothold, even with the port and railway built by Germans?
It comes right back to that paradox from the beginning, the gold standard. German goods priced in gold marks were often just too expensive compared to goods from competitors, maybe from Britain operating out of silver-based Hong Kong, or even from other protectionist countries.
So the infrastructure was great, but it mainly benefited Chinese exports.
Largely, yes, or it benefited German shipping cartels carrying those exports, often at subsidized rates negotiated through the state mechanisms. It wasn't helping the average German manufacturer sell textiles or machinery in Shandong. Only a very small, select group of German firms really thrived.
Like Arnhold and Karberg.
Right. And they thrived because they landed big outsourced infrastructure contracts directly from Xufu's provincial government, like building the power plant in Jinan, the provincial capital. Their success depended entirely on the Chinese state, not on competing in an open market.
Which brings us full circle, back to our case study, Diedrichson, Gibson and Company, D&J. They came into Qingdao expecting, what, a controlled, but maybe fair, predictable market.
That seems to have been the hope. A place where the rules, even if set by the Navy, would be clear and consistently applied.
But what did they actually find by, say, 1906?
They found an environment that had become, in their view, completely dominated by politics, by state interference, by favoritism. Jacob Jepsen wrote very frustratingly that most German merchants in Qingdao weren't making it based on business acumen. They were essentially surviving on government subsidies or these state-linked contracts. The hassle, the bureaucratic cost of doing business, just outweighed any potential profit from the market itself.
So, faced with all these obstacles, plus weakening general demand, especially as those non-native Cantonese merchants who were big buyers started pulling their money and business out strategically, D&J just threw in the towel.
They finally accepted that the Qingdao venture, for them, was a failure. They formally dissolved their partnership in December 1908, just 10 years after they started there.
And their departure must have sent a pretty strong signal to other German businesses.
A huge signal. It showed that the Qingdao experiment, as envisioned by independent, free-trading Hanseatic merchants, was basically financially unviable.
The aftermath of D&J splitting up is really interesting too, showing how the strategy had to change. Heinrich Diedrichson stayed in North China.
But he completely shifted his focus. He actually teamed up with his old rival, Karlowitz, and they concentrated only on big state-related projects. He accepted that to work in North China now, you had to work with and through the Chinese state-regulated system.
While Jacob Jepsen and Heinrich Jessen did the opposite.
Completely. They formed a new company, Jebsen and Jessen, and made a very deliberate choice to focus all their efforts far to the south, below the Yangtze River. They went straight for the less regulated markets, Hong Kong, Canton places still operating more under the old laissez-faire model.
That geographical split perfectly captures the fragmentation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
State-controlled north versus market-driven south.
It really does. And what's just fascinating when you step back is how this global fight between the British free trade approach and the German, U.S., French protectionist leanings was just skillfully played by Chinese regional officials like Xufu.
They used German tools against German interests in a way.
Exactly. They used German infrastructure, German customs breaks, even German investment capital to build their own regional protectionist economy in Shandong.
And the result?
Paradoxical. German colonial investment, which was intended at least partly to boost German trade, ended up unintentionally accelerating the modernization and strengthening of the regional Chinese state. This regulated environment pulled Chinese business into politics, tied their success to the provincial government's goals, and ultimately empowered that regional state economically and politically.
So in the end, the free market model definitely lost out in Shandong. But the German interventionist model didn't really win either.
No. The winner, arguably, was the Chinese regulatory state at the provincial level. Hashtag outro.
What a fascinating turnaround. So the German colonial government sets up Qingdao, trying to create this stable, regulated base for German business, trying to avoid the chaos they saw in the British laissez-faire port.
Right, a controlled experiment.
But their very investments, the port, the railway, that crucial customs discount on straw braids, ended up giving the Chinese provincial government the tools it needed to implement its own aggressive protectionist policies, the Xinjiang reforms.
Policies that explicitly favored native Chinese businesses and ended up squeezing out those initial independent German traders, like our example, Diederiksen and Jebsen.
So that big global clash, laissez-faire versus protectionism, it didn't end with one side just crushing the other in Shandong.
No, not at all. Instead, it created this really complex hybrid system, a state-centric regional economy, where Chinese officials were actively and pretty masterfully playing the global powers off against each other, using foreign tools for their own regional benefit.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. It brings us back to the absolute foundation of this whole conflict. Money. Currency. We saw that the Western powers, the U.S., France, Germany, they kept pushing China at different times to adopt a gold exchange standard. To stabilize the currency, make foreign trade easier for them.
Right. But China resisted, fundamentally resisted, staying on a silver standard for the most part during this period.
So the question is, what if China had adopted the gold exchange standard back then? Say, right after the Boxer Protocol in 1901, when the pressure was really on. How fundamentally different might the rise of that state economic power in Shandong and maybe across China have been?
Would centralizing currency control under a gold standard have actually accelerated modernization in a different way? Or would it have just changed how foreign influence worked, maybe ensuring profits still flowed to foreign banks and intermediaries just under a different monetary system? How much leverage did China gain, especially regional players like Xufu, by keeping control over their silver-based system? Something to think about.